"Hands up, don't move." Leonard Ford froze. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady at shoulder height, palms open. He could feel the cold wind biting through his coat, but it wasn't the chill that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the sound of Officer James Hill's voice, sharp and commanding. Tyrone, his 17-year-old grandson, stood beside him, eyes wide, just as still, just as terrified. Tyrone had been so careful, always the good kid. He'd lived through enough loss already, first his mother, then his father, and yet here he was, still trying to make the most of every single day. The bright future that was ahead of him, the dreams of becoming a civil engineer, all seemed to hang in the balance. He had come so far in life, working his way through high school, keeping his grades up, making his grandfather proud. Leonard had raised him since the age of 2, after his daughter's tragic death in a car accident. The bond between them was unspoken but strong. Leonard had taught Tyrone everything he knew: math, history, how to build a strong foundation in life. But now it was all slipping away. Leonard watched as Officer Hill, a man with a badge that once meant something, stood a few feet away, his hand hovering dangerously near his sidearm. He could feel the tension in the air, the steady rise of something, dark and inevitable. Leonard had been a teacher for years, a veteran with calm eyes and steady hands. But there was nothing he could do in this moment. No lesson to teach, no solution to offer. Hill's eyes were cold, scanning Tyrone, searching for something that wasn't there. Tyrone wasn't reaching for anything. His hands were visible. He was doing everything right, standing still, complying. Leonard's heart twisted with the weight of the moment. They'd been here before. A quiet neighborhood, a police car that had no reason to stop them, but did anyway. Officer Hill had been known in the community for years, not for his service, but for his attitude, for the way he looked at the people who lived here, the way he treated them like criminals without cause. There were stories, whispers among neighbors. Leonard had known Hill long enough to see the arrogance in his eyes, the way he carried himself like he had the power to do whatever he wanted without consequence. As Hill stepped forward, Leonard tried to steady his breathing, tried to calm his racing mind, but it was too late. Tyrone shifted his weight, a small, hesitant movement, just to take a step back from the looming threat in front of him. His palms were still raised. His face, a mask of confusion and fear, mirrored Leonard's own feelings. The night had fallen quiet, save for the crunch of boots on the snow, the flash of red and blue from the patrol car, and the sound of their own breath, too loud in the freezing air. Then it happened. Without warning, the air was filled with the crack of gunfire, 2 deafening shots in rapid succession. Leonard's heart stopped in that instant, and then his world crumbled around him as his grandson's body jerked violently and collapsed to the ground. The world seemed to freeze. Snow, once crisp and untouched, was now stained with red Tyrone's blood, seeping into the earth beneath him. His wide eyes stared at nothing, the light dimming from them faster than Leonard could reach him. His legs, still twitching, folded under him as his body hit the ground. There was no scream. There was no warning. Just the raw, senseless violence of a life snuffed out. Leonard's chest tightened as he fell to his knees beside his grandson. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to cradle Tyrone's head in his lap, but the warmth was draining too quickly. The world blurred around him. His breath, the cold air, the flashing lights, it all faded into the background. His mind raced. He couldn't process it, couldn't understand what had just happened. Officer Hill stood frozen, gun still drawn, eyes wide with something: regret, fear, or maybe just cold indifference. There was no weapon in Tyrone's hands, no reason for him to be shot. But Leonard could already feel the weight of the injustice settling around him, thick and suffocating. It was only then that Leonard realized what Hill had done. He wasn't just another officer doing his job. No, this was a man who had pulled the trigger out of fear, out of a history of seeing nothing but threats in the people he was supposed to serve. Hill had taken a life. And for what? The snow continued to fall softly around them, covering the scene with an eerie blanket of white. There were no sirens at first. No backup arrived to help. Leonard's cries were swallowed by the cold as he rocked his grandson's limp body. His hands, once so steady, were now trembling with rage, with grief, with a helplessness he had never known before. A few moments passed before the police finally arrived, the scene turning into something that felt like a nightmare. Hill's body cam footage, when reviewed later, would show nothing but Tyrone's innocence. His hands raised, his body backing away. There was no reason for the officer to have fired. But in the end, it didn't matter. Hill would be protected. By the system. His report would justify his actions. I feared for my life. The district attorney, after a quick review of the footage, would release a statement. It was a tragedy. There isn't enough evidence to press charges. Officer Hill acted in self-defense. Leonard knew the truth. The world knew the truth. But it was no longer about truth. It was about something much darker. It was about a broken system that let killers walk free while victims were erased, forgotten. And so, Leonard's grief turned into something else. A resolve began to form in the shadows, quiet and relentless. He would make sure Tyrone was not just another statistic. He would make sure someone paid for this. The days after Tyrone's death moved with a strange, surreal quality. The world kept turning, but Leonard's heart had stopped. He didn't cry. At first, not right away. Instead, there was this hollow numbness, a feeling that filled him completely. He sat in his living room, the house eerily quiet without Tyrone's presence. His grandson, the one he had raised, the one who had filled his life with so much promise, was gone. The house that once echoed with laughter and the sound of books flipping open was now dead silent. Tyrone's shoes, his jacket, his books, all untouched. The clock ticked on the wall, the only noise breaking the silence, but Leonard couldn't bring himself to move. His mind kept flashing back to moments that seemed so small at the time, but were now monumental. Tyrone sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil behind his ear, working on his homework. The two of them watching old black and white movies, laughing at the jokes that Tyrone didn't quite understand. Those moments, simple and quiet, now felt like echoes of a life that had been stolen in an instant. Tyrone had been everything to Leonard. When his daughter passed, he'd made the promise to raise Tyrone the best he could, to give him the life she would have wanted for him. Tyrone had become more than just a grandson. He was the last piece of Leonard's heart, the last link to his daughter. The future Leonard had built for them both was now shattered. The community was reeling. Leonard's neighbors, the ones who had watched Tyrone grow up, couldn't comprehend what had happened. The local church held a prayer service, the small community gathering in shock. There were murmurs, the whispering of what they all knew to be true. Tyrone hadn't deserved to die. He was a good kid, quiet, respectful. He hadn't done anything wrong. But those whispers weren't enough to drown out the silence that Leonard felt. No one could fix what had happened. No one could bring Tyrone back. The funeral was a blur. Leonard stood there, holding his grandson's casket, numb. His body felt like it was moving on autopilot. He didn't want to see his friends, his neighbors. He didn't want their condolences. The only thing that mattered now was the empty space Tyrone left behind. The finality of it was crushing. Leonard had been to too many funerals, but this one felt different. This one cut too deep. His boy, his pride, his future gone forever. And yet, through the grief, there was anger, fury, actually. He couldn't ignore it. Not when the world seemed to turn a blind eye to what had happened. Not when the system, the very system that was supposed to protect him and Tyrone, turned its back. A few days later, Leonard sat in front of the television, watching the news. The footage of Tyrone's death was being replayed again. They showed the body cam footage Tyrone with his hands raised, his body language clearly showing he was no threat. The officer, Hill, had escalated the situation. But Hill was still wearing his badge. No consequences, no accountability. It was business as usual for him. And for the justice system, the district attorney had already made their decision. There isn't enough evidence to charge Officer Hill, the statement echoed from the screen. What happened was a misunderstanding, a tragedy, but there was no criminal intent. Leonard's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles turning white. The anger surged up from somewhere deep inside him, flooding his chest. A misunderstanding, he repeated to himself, his voice low, trembling with disbelief. There was nothing. misunderstood about it. Hill had killed his grandson. He had fired without cause. Leonard could see it in his mind's eye the way Tyrone had backed away, his hands up, his heart racing. He had been no threat to anyone, least of all Officer Hill, but the world had failed Tyrone. The system that was meant to protect him had failed him. Leonard slammed his fist against the arm of the chair. "They're letting him walk free," he muttered bitterly, as the newscaster's voice continued in the background. The officer had acted in self-defense. There was no intent to harm. The officer's actions, while unfortunate, were justified. Leonard shook his head in disbelief. Justified? He had no words for it. He was drowning in anger and grief, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. He had no choice but to make them see, to make them understand that what had happened was not right, not just for Tyrone, but for the countless others who had been silenced before him. That night, Leonard lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts, images, and memories of Tyrone. He couldn't let go. He couldn't move on. He didn't care about moving on. What good was it to keep moving forward when the world kept taking the things you loved? When they kept justifying actions like Officer Hill's, making excuses, pretending like there was no consequence. Leonard had seen injustice before, had lived through enough to know how the system worked. But this time, something had snapped inside him. This time, it wasn't just about Tyrone. It was about all the children, all the families who had been forgotten, ignored, or wronged. It was about standing up when the world tried to shove you down. It was about making sure no one could forget Tyrone's name. He didn't want revenge. Leonard had never been a man for violence. But as the days passed and the outrage grew, as the streets filled with protests and the news cycle turned the page, Leonard's resolve hardened. Revenge wasn't what he was after. It was justice. The kind of justice that only comes when you force the hand of a broken system. He spent the next few days thinking, planning, quietly, methodically. He knew he couldn't rely on anyone else to fix this. No one would take up his fight. And so, Leonard Ford began to plan. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing Officer Hill would pay. Not with a trial, not with an indictment, but in a way that made him understand the gravity of his actions. In a way that made him feel the weight of Tyrone's death on his shoulders, just as Leonard had carried it, every single day since the moment the shots rang out. The truth was, Leonard had no illusions about the law. He knew what would happen if he waited for the system to deliver justice. He knew the DA's office had already made its decision. The world wasn't going to fix itself. But Leonard knew something else, too. He had something the system didn't. Time, patience, and the kind of resolve that could outlast anything the system had to throw at him. The night of the vigil was cold, the air biting through Leonard's jacket, but it wasn't the chill that made his breath catch in his chest. It was the weight of the community's sorrow, the collective grief of a town that had just lost one of its own. Leonard stood at the edge of the crowd, the faint flicker of candles casting shadows across his face, but he could not bring himself to light one. The loss was too fresh, too raw. He had no words to offer, no prayers to speak. His heart was too full of anger to join in the quiet reverence around him. Tyrone's smile, his laughter, the promise of his future, they were all gone now. All of that potential, all the years of hard work, just vanished in a moment. Leonard's hands shook as he clutched his coat tighter around himself, as if that would somehow shield him from the truth. The crowd was gathered in silence, some holding candles, others holding signs with Tyrone's face or simple words like justice. For Tyrone, no justice, no peace. There were tears, but there was also a quiet strength in the air, a shared understanding that this wasn't just about one man or one family. It was about the community, about the very system that had failed them. The local church had offered the space, the pastor delivering a prayer, but it was Leonard who was asked to speak. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd as Leonard stepped to the front, his grief-heavy shoulders hunched beneath the weight of expectations he hadn't asked for. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He had always been someone who stayed out of the spotlight, preferring the quiet life. But now, in the face of his grandson's senseless death, he had been thrust forward as a representative of the anger and grief that the System refused to acknowledge. Leonard stood there for a long time, looking out over the sea of faces. His eyes scanned the crowd, but he couldn't bring himself to focus on any one person. The words, the ones he thought he would say, caught in his throat. Instead, what came out was silence. Deep, unbroken silence. The quiet filled the air, becoming an unspoken statement in itself. It was as if the very act of not speaking spoke volumes. The crowd, expecting Leonard to give them some sense of comfort, instead found themselves held in the same emotional space, heavy, broken, and unsure of where to go from here. It was a silence full of grief, full of loss, but also something else, something deeper. Anger. Leonard's gaze, distant and unfocused, moved to the flickering flames of the candles. He didn't seek vengeance. He wouldn't stand in front of this crowd and say those words. His heart burned with too much grief, but also a quiet fury. He couldn't articulate it, not yet. But in the silence of that moment, everyone felt it. The community could feel the depth of his loss, but they also sensed the quiet storm building inside him. It was a storm they couldn't yet understand, but would soon witness in full force. After a long moment, Leonard turned to leave, his back straight, his steps measured, but his heart was a battlefield. He couldn't stay in the crowd any longer, couldn't bear the eyes that followed him, the whispers that followed him, the sympathy that no longer mattered. The vigil ended with people lingering, but Leonard left quickly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as he made his way home. He could hear the voices of the crowd in his head, the distant murmur of their prayers, the quiet calls for justice. But it wasn't justice that Leonard sought anymore. No, what he needed was something else. Something that didn't involve the courts, the legal system, or the people who had already failed him. Justice had failed his grandson, and Leonard knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to come from any judge, any jury, or any press conference. Justice was going to have to come from somewhere else. The days after the vigil were a blur of sadness and frustration. The town, once united in grief, was beginning to fracture. Protests began outside the police station, banners declaring "Justice for Tyrone" and "Accountability for Officer Hill" painted in bold, angry letters. But even as the community demanded answers, Leonard knew nothing would come from it. The DA had already made up their mind. They had already sided with Hill. Leonard spent his nights awake, the silence of his house only broken by the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't rest. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Tyrone had fallen, about the way Hill's face had been devoid of any remorse, about the way the world had just moved on. But Leonard wasn't going to move on. Not this time. The anger that had burned quietly at the vigil was now building inside him, a fire he could no longer ignore. But it wasn't just anger. It was something more, something cold, something focused. Revenge wasn't what he wanted. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no other choice. The system had failed, and now it was up to him to do what it could not. Leonard had spent his life as a teacher, teaching others how to think, how to solve problems. But he had also been a military strategist in his younger years, serving his country in ways most people would never understand. He had learned how to wait, how to observe, how to strike when the moment was right. And now he would use those skills again. But this time, the target wasn't a foreign enemy. It was a man who wore a badge. He began his work quietly, in the shadows. Night after night, he sat at his kitchen table, researching Officer James Hill. He knew Hill's name, his badge number, but Leonard needed more. He needed to know everything about Hill, his habits, his schedule, his weaknesses. He spent hours online, tracking Hill's movements, compiling everything he could find. He learned about Hill's past, his troubled history with the community, his family, his routines. Leonard's anger was becoming something else, now a quiet determination, a strategy. He spent his days in a fog of grief and rage, but his nights were consumed with meticulous planning. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Leonard would not let Tyrone's death be another forgotten incident. He would make Hill pay, though. Not with violence, not just yet. No, Leonard's retribution would be something far more precise, far more calculated. His grief had given birth to something far darker, far more methodical. Leonard wasn't just reacting. He was preparing. And in the coming days, his actions would speak louder than any courtroom verdict ever could. As Leonard spent his nights in silence, watching Hill's every move from the shadows, a quiet solidarity was building in the community. People began to ask questions. The protests grew louder, the voices more insistent. But the system, as it always did, turned a deaf ear. And so, Leonard continued his work alone, hidden in the dark corners of his home, while the world outside grew more restless. The question was no longer if Leonard would seek justice. The question was when. The world, it seemed, was beginning to notice that Leonard Ford wasn't just a grieving grandfather anymore. He was becoming something else, something far more dangerous to the men who had taken Tyrone's life. And as the days passed, Leonard's resolve hardened into something unshakable. He wasn't just waiting for justice. He was making it. And Officer Hill wouldn't know what hit him. Leonard stood at his kitchen table, the dim light above him casting long shadows across the room. His fingers moved methodically across the stack of papers in front of him. Notes, photos, schedules, maps, all meticulously organized. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. His years of experience, both as a teacher and a military strategist, had prepared him for moments like this, though he had never imagined using them in this way. But the system had failed him, and now Leonard had only one option left: justice. His own kind of justice. His plan, though simple, felt inevitable, like a wave that had already started to rise and could no longer be stopped. Leonard knew the dangers of moving too quickly, too rashly. He wasn't acting on impulse. Every action was carefully considered. He'd studied Officer James Hill long enough to know the officer's routine. Hill's arrogance and disregard for those around him had become his Achilles heel, and Leonard was about to exploit it. Day after day, Leonard watched from a distance, keeping track of Hill's movements. It was always the same. A police officer left his home at exactly 6:30 a.m., his patrol car humming down the street. He stopped by the corner store for coffee, then drove to the precinct. In the evening, after his shift, Hill would stop by the local bar. Always the same place, always at the same time. Leonard had spent weeks tracking these small details, learning everything he could about Hill's habits, his weaknesses, his rhythms. Leonard didn't have to know Hill's every move, just the ones that mattered. And now, those pieces had aligned perfectly. The first step of the plan was the hardest. Leonard knew the law, and he knew it didn't work for people like him. It didn't work for Tyrone. It hadn't worked for the countless others who had been silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. So Leonard would force the system's hand. He would give them no choice but to see the truth. On the quietest night, Leonard prepared the package. He knew exactly what he needed to include: irrefutable evidence that Officer Hill's actions weren't isolated, weren't simply mistakes in the heat of the moment. No, Leonard would expose Hill for what he truly was: man who used his badge not for service, but for control, for power, for oppression. He packed the materials carefully, ensuring every detail was accounted for. There would be no room for doubt. The package contained 3 items. First, there was a flash drive, unmarked. It wasn't big just enough to hold what Leonard needed. Audio recordings, videos, and emails detailing Hill's corrupt dealings, his discriminatory remarks, and his abuse of power. Leonard had managed to find a few sources within the precinct who had grown tired of Hill's arrogance. Anonymous tips had begun to trickle in, small, seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence that Leonard had pulled together into something unassailable. Second, Leonard included a series of hand-drawn blueprints. These weren't just any blueprints. They were for weapons designed and used by Hill in his private dealings with local criminals. Weapons that Hill had used to intimidate, to threaten, to control. The blueprints were a confession of Hill's true nature, and Leonard had made sure they were too specific, too detailed to be dismissed. Finally, there was a single sheet of notebook paper. The words were written in bold, deliberate strokes, each one a strike against the lies Hill had built around himself. You wanted insufficient evidence, I left none. Leonard folded the paper carefully and placed it at the bottom of the package. With everything packed, Leonard sealed the envelope and addressed it to the district attorney. He knew the day had already made a decision to protect Officer Hill, to sweep his past under the rug. But Leonard was about to change that dot. A package was delivered anonymously to the DA's office the following morning. Leonard had no intention of waiting around to see the outcome. That wasn't the way this worked. He had made his move, and now the ball was in the system's court. The clock began to tick. Hill, of course, had no idea what was coming. He went about his days as usual, unaware that the very foundation of his world was about to be pulled out from under him. Leonard didn't need to be physically present to see the storm coming. He'd set the pieces in motion. The next move was up to the world, but Leonard had a feeling he knew exactly how things would unfold. The DA's office didn't wait long to act. By noon, news of the anonymous package had made its way through the proper channels. The DA's office couldn't ignore the gravity of what had been delivered to them. They couldn't simply look away. For the first time in months, they had to face the truth. The investigation was reopened. As the investigation into Officer Hill's actions took off, Leonard watched from the shadows. Hill's once unshakable confidence began to unravel. Leonard could see the cracks appear, the moments when Hill began to question his safety, his future. In the days that followed, Hill's life became a constant weight of paranoia. The once loud, confident cop who had ruled his precinct with a cocky smile now spent his time with his head down, nervously glancing over his shoulder. Leonard had done what he knew would rattle Hill the most. He'd attacked Hill's reputation, the very thing that had made him untouchable. Hill began to feel the heat of the investigation on his back. At first, it was subtle. His colleagues began to look at him differently. Whispers started behind his back. He noticed a few of his fellow officers growing distant, avoiding eye contact, passing him over when it came to decision-making. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the way they began to question his integrity. But the real trouble began at home. His wife, Carol, had always been his rock, his safe haven. But as the news of the reopened investigation began to spread, she became anxious, her nerves fraying. She'd always trusted Hill, believed in the man he was. But now she was starting to see the cracks. Leonard's influence was starting to seep into Hill's personal life, and Carol could feel it. She began to ask questions, not out loud, but with her eyes. The tension in their house grew thick, the silence more oppressive. At night, Hill couldn't sleep. The quiet, once comforting, now felt like a prison. He found himself checking the locks on the doors over and over, pacing in the hallway until his feet ached. The unease was becoming overwhelming. Hill was used to being in control, used to commanding respect, but now he was being dismantled piece by piece. Leonard didn't need to be visible to do this. He had already planted the seeds. All Hill could do now was watch as his world began to collapse. The pressure built as the investigation gained steam. Hill could feel it, his peace of mind, his reputation, his authority, all of it slipping away. Every day was a battle to keep his cool, to pretend he wasn't being watched, that his every move wasn't being scrutinized. His colleagues, once loyal, were beginning to turn. The whispers grew louder. The media took notice. The more Hill tried to hold on to control, the more it slipped from his grasp. But Leonard wasn't done yet. His strategy was far from over. He wasn't going to let the investigation play out in the way Hill hoped. No, Leonard's influence was too deep now, too calculated. He had already planted the seeds of doubt, and now Hill was starting to reap what Leonard had sown. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching Hill's unraveling. Leonard wasn't moved by hatred, nor did he take pleasure in the destruction. But he knew what Hill had taken from him. He knew the cost of what had been lost. And now it was time for Hill to feel the weight of it, to experience firsthand the loss Leonard had endured. But Leonard wasn't the only one paying attention. The community, too, was watching. They could feel the shift, the change in the air. They could sense that Leonard was no longer just grieving. They could feel the quiet determination building. And though they didn't yet know how it would unfold, they all understood one thing. Justice, as they had always known it, wasn't going to be the answer this time. The world was about to witness a different kind of reckoning. And Officer James Hill was the first to feel its weight. The shift in Officer James Hill's demeanor was subtle at first. It began with small things, late arrivals at the precinct, hesitations in his voice when speaking with colleagues, occasional unkempt uniform, but Leonard saw it all. Hill, once confident, Once the figure of control in his world was now slipping. It was the way Hill began to recoil when a fellow officer would brush against him too closely. How he started to look over his shoulder, scanning the crowd like a man expecting someone to pounce from the shadows. Leonard wasn't there in the moments when Hill's paranoia first began to consume him, but he knew it was happening. Leonard's plan had always been one of precision, a slow, deliberate unraveling that would leave Hill trapped within his own fear. And it was working. Every day, Leonard's shadow grew longer. Hill's world, once orderly and defined by routine, was beginning to fracture. Leonard had never directly confronted him. He didn't need to. The mere presence of his actions, the calculated destruction of Hill's reputation, was more than enough. The first cracks came within the precinct itself. Leonard's anonymous tip had set the wheels in motion, forcing the DA's office to take action. The investigation into Hill, once a quiet afterthought, now dominated the media. Every new revelation made Hill's position more precarious. The stories began to pile up, whispers of corrupt dealings, vague allegations of violence during previous arrests, and worst of all, Hill's own history of racist remarks, both on and off duty. These were things that should have been exposed years ago, but now, thanks to Leonard's hand, they were front-page news. Hill was not used to this kind of scrutiny. Officers like him didn't get exposed. They were untouchable, their actions hidden behind the badge. But now Hill was the one being watched, the one whose every move was under a microscope. The way the media painted him as the villain, the poster child for everything that was wrong with policing, it wore on him. It gnawed at him every moment he stepped outside. Even his fellow officers, once loyal to him, began to distance themselves. They would avoid his gaze, shift away in hallways, speak in hushed tones when he entered a room. Hill could feel it, the slow isolation, the weight of suspicion on his shoulders, dragging him deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. And still, Leonard remained in the background, a figure unseen, but always present. Hill never knew who was behind this, but he could feel the hand of something far larger than himself at work. Leonard was making Hill's life a living hell, but without ever laying a finger on him. The power of the mind, the suffocating weight of fear, it was more destructive than anything Leonard could have done physically. But Leonard didn't stop there. No, he knew that if he was going to truly dismantle Hill, he had to go deeper. He had to go after what Hill cared about most: his family, his sense of security. Hill's wife, Carol, had been his one remaining anchor, but even she was starting to notice the changes. She saw the way he snapped at the smallest things, how his eyes no longer sparkled when he looked at her, how his confidence had eroded into something dark and broken. She began to worry. But as the days wore on, she grew more frightened than concerned. Her husband was no longer the man she had married. He had become someone unrecognizable, a stranger wrapped in the same skin. One night, after the evening news aired a segment detailing Hill's troubled history, Carol confronted him. The words were sharp and cold, her frustration finally boiling. "Over. James, what's happening to you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. Hill's response was a growl, low and menacing. "You wouldn't understand." He turned away from her, refusing to make eye contact, and that was the moment Carol knew it wasn't just the media or the investigation eating away at him. There was something darker, something deeper. She didn't know what it was, but she felt it. The terror in his eyes when he looked out the window at night, the way he kept checking the locks on the door, the way his hands trembled when he held a cup of coffee. These were the signs of a man unraveling, and she could see it. Leonard had already begun to take control of Hill's life in ways the officer couldn't even comprehend. Hill's connection to his family was being dismantled piece by piece. Carol began to notice how the bills weren't being paid on time, how the bank statements didn't match up, how her husband was draining their accounts without explanation. Hill, in his panic, had resorted to desperate measures. The same criminal contacts he'd once used to bully others, to cover up his mistakes, were now being used to help him in ways that would eventually backfire. But the real damage was being done in the dark, in the places where Hill couldn't see it. Leonard's influence had spread far and wide. He'd learned about Hill's financial dealings, his questionable investments, and the shady under-the-table transactions that the officer had been involved in. And now, Leonard was cutting ties, pulling strings to expose Hill's financial instability, turning Hill's professional world upside down. As Hill began to spiral, Leonard's moves grew bolder. He tipped off the precinct's internal affairs division, leading them to investigate Hill's questionable actions. Leonard had made sure the investigation would dig deep, unearthing every dirty secret Hill had kept hidden. By the time the officers at the precinct started to question him, Hill's paranoia was in full swing. He had no idea who was behind it all, but the constant pressure was beginning to take its toll. The walls were closing in on him. The night that Leonard chose to make his final move, Hill was at his breaking point. The investigation was no longer just about his job, it was about his entire life. The rumors that had been swirling around him for months had turned into an undeniable truth. The press had gotten their hands on the evidence Leonard had carefully planted, and now Hill was the target of a full-blown media circus. He was on the verge of losing everything. He started questioning the safety of his own home. Leonard had planted the seeds of doubt everywhere at the precinct, in Hill's home, in his family life. Hill couldn't trust anyone anymore. His colleagues were turning against him. His wife was growing distant, and he was beginning to feel the weight of his actions more than ever. He started checking the windows at night, obsessively pulling back the curtains to look outside, his heart racing every time a car drove past his house. But Leonard had already done his work. The system was turning against Hill, his reputation tarnished beyond repair, and his career slowly coming to an end. It wasn't just his professional life that was crumbling, it was everything. Hill's downfall was not marked by a dramatic moment of confrontation, but by the slow, suffocating realization that he had nowhere left to hide. Leonard had already stripped him of his power. Hill's paranoia had bloomed into full-blown terror. He began to imagine things that weren't their voices in the dark, shadows creeping along his hallway, footsteps behind him when no one was there. Leonard's presence, though invisible, was inescapable. The final blow came when Hill found an envelope waiting for him at his front door. The envelope contained a single photograph, a shot of Hill's own house taken from a distance, with Leonard's words written across the back. "It's already too late." Hill froze. The terror that gripped him was primal, deep-rooted in his fear of the unknown. He had no idea who was behind this, but he knew one thing for certain: he was being hunted, and the person doing the hunting had already won. He looked around his house, feeling the walls close in, feeling the weight of every decision he had ever made crash down on him. He had no allies left. He had no safety net. Hill had spent his entire life believing that power could protect him, that his badge could shield him from consequences. Now, that belief was gone, shattered beyond recognition. Leonard watched from the shadows, but he wasn't satisfied with Hill's terror. He wasn't interested in watching the man suffer. Leonard wasn't a monster. He didn't want to see Hill broken, but justice demanded it. And Leonard had set everything in motion to ensure Hill understood the cost of taking Tyrone's life. As Hill's life unraveled, Leonard's quiet resolve deepened. He knew that he had already won. Hill's terror was the final acknowledgement of everything Leonard had done. The revenge wasn't about satisfaction. It was about accountability. And Leonard had made sure that Officer James Hill would never forget the price of his actions. As Leonard disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Hill to confront the broken remnants of his life, he realized one thing: justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it comes with silence. And in the silence of Hill's crumbling world, Leonard found his peace. Leonard had never been one to seek public attention. Throughout his life, he'd stayed in the background, living quietly, focusing on his family and his work. He had taught for decades, had served his country with dignity, and had raised his grandson, Tyrone, with everything he had. But in the face of the brutal loss of his grandson, Leonard had come to understand something he'd never truly grasped before. Sometimes, justice didn't arrive in the way you expected. Sometimes it was something you had to take for yourself, in a way that would leave the world unable to ignore the truth. The moment Hill's darkest secrets began to surface, Leonard knew the game was nearing its end. But what he was about to do wasn't just about exposing Hill. It was about making sure Hill would never be able to hide again. His name would forever be tarnished, his reputation irrevocably destroyed. And he would face the world as the monster he truly was, a man who used his badge to terrorize the people he was meant to protect. Leonard had planned this carefully, just as he had every other part of his quest for justice. His final act wouldn't come with a bang or a violent confrontation. No, it would come with a whisper, and then an avalanche. Leonard had already begun the process of exposing Hill's past. Through the media, through private conversations, and even within the police department itself, Leonard had planted the seeds that were now beginning to bloom. The first act of his plan came when the press ran an explosive story. A journalist, tipped off by Leonard's anonymous sources, published an article detailing Hill's past, the indiscretions, the corruption, the abuse of power. It wasn't just the police misconduct that was exposed. It was Hill's entire life, laid bare for the world to see. The long history of shady deals, the unreported incidents of violence, the racist comments made behind closed doors, it all came out. But that was just the beginning. The media didn't just report facts, they painted Hill as a monster, an officer who had used his badge to bully and intimidate, someone who had done far worse than just shoot an innocent teenager in cold blood. Real humiliation came next. Leonard knew that to break Hill, he needed to remove the foundations upon which Hill's life had been built. Hill wasn't just an officer, he was a family man, a man who had always relied on his position to maintain the life he had built. Leonard's next move struck at the heart of Hill's personal life. His relationship with his wife, Carol. Through quiet, unseen means, Leonard had planted rumors, whispers about Hill's infidelities, about his financial troubles, about his involvement with known criminals from his past. Leonard didn't need to create new stories. He simply had to bring to light the secrets Hill had long kept hidden. As these rumors spread, Carol began to suspect the truth. The relationship between the two grew strained. Leonard knew that Hill's house, once a place of safety and love, would soon become a battleground of doubt and mistrust. Carol confronted Hill, but by the time she did, the damage was already done. Her trust had been shattered, and she no longer saw him the way she once had. Their marriage began to crumble, and Hill, for the first time in his life, found himself truly alone. The tipping point came when Leonard orchestrated the final act of public humiliation. Using a contact within the local police union, Leonard sent an anonymous tip to the precinct, including photos and video clips that Hill had hoped would remain hidden forever. They showed Hill's connections to dangerous criminals, his involvement in illegal activities, and his attempts to cover up previous misconducts. The footage was damning, and Leonard knew exactly how to make sure it found its way into the right hands. The local news, already hungry for a scandal, picked up the story, and Hill was thrust into the spotlight once again. But this time, it wasn't just the press. The Internal Affairs Department got involved. They could no longer turn a blind eye to Hill's actions. The evidence Leonard had carefully provided was undeniable. A full investigation was launched into Hill's conduct, and the pressure was relentless. Hill's colleagues, once his allies, began to turn against him. His badge, the symbol of his power, became a mark of shame. The precinct was forced to suspend him, and word spread quickly that Hill would be facing charges for his actions. The walls Hill had built around himself began to crumble. The force that had once shielded him from accountability was now the very thing that would expose him to the world. The moment Leonard had been waiting for finally arrived. It was a Wednesday morning when Leonard saw the news. Officer James Hill had been officially dismissed from the force. The press release was cold and matter-of-fact, as if Hill's fall from grace was just another casualty of public opinion. But Leonard knew the truth. Hill had been publicly humiliated, stripped of everything he had ever worked for. The badge, the uniform, the respect he once commanded, all of it had been taken away from him in the most public way possible. The entire community now saw Hill for who he truly was, a man who had used his position of power to carry out acts of violence and oppression, a man who had been a predator in the very community he was sworn to protect. Leonard didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel joy. His vengeance was never about making Hill suffer. It was about making sure Tyrone's death wasn't forgotten. It was about ensuring the world saw Hill as the monster he was. In the years to come, Leonard knew the name James Hill would never be spoken with the same respect again. Hill's reputation, once built on lies, was now shattered beyond repair. The truth had been exposed, and nothing would ever be able to hide it again. The symbolism of what Leonard had done was profound. Hill's downfall wasn't marked by a single violent act or a final confrontation. No, Leonard had delivered justice in a way that spoke to the power of truth and the inevitability of consequence. By stripping Hill of everything that once gave him power, Leonard had created a version of justice that the legal system had failed to provide. As Leonard watched Hill's career crumble, he also watched the ripple effects within the community. The protests that had once been filled with anger and frustration now began to calm. The marches, the signs, the chants for justice, they had all been a response to a broken system, a system that had failed too many times. But Leonard's actions had given the community something they hadn't had before: accountability. The victory wasn't in Hill's downfall, it was in the knowledge that someone, just one man, had made sure the truth was seen. The community saw the system had failed, but Leonard had forced it to reckon with itself. At home, Carol, Hill's wife, filed for divorce shortly after the media coverage died down. She was devastated, yes, but more than that, she was disillusioned. Leonard had taken everything Hill had worked for. Hill no longer had the respect of his peers, and his family, once his greatest strength, had now turned its back on him. The broken man Leonard had turned Hill into was no longer the man Carol had once known. She left him, the final nail in the coffin of the life Hill had once known. Leonard knew he couldn't bring Tyrone back. He couldn't undo the years of trauma and grief that had been thrust upon him. But what he could do was make sure that Hill knew, deep in his soul, the cost of his actions. Leonard's revenge wasn't a tale of violence or retribution. It was a story of a quiet, deliberate reckoning. The justice that had been denied to him and his grandson was delivered in the most unexpected way through the slow, irreversible dismantling of a man who had used his badge to destroy lives. In the end, Leonard's story was not about violence. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about justice, served on a scale that no courtroom could provide. It was about making sure that the world remembered Tyrone's name, that Hill could never escape the consequences of his actions. It was about the quiet power of one man who had the courage to stand against a broken system. And as Leonard disappeared back into the quiet shadows of his life, leaving Hill to face the consequences of his downfall, he realized that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it moves in silence, leaving the world to reckon with the truth on its own. Leonard stood in the dim light of his small living room, watching the news report on the television screen. The glowing images of Hill's public downfall flickered. In front of him, footage of his disgraceful dismissal from the police force, the press conferences, the protests that filled the streets, and the media frenzy that had exploded around him. The story had been told, the evidence exposed, and Hill's life, once untouchable, had been reduced to rubble. But Leonard felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no joy. As the screen flashed with the image of Hill's tear-streaked face, Leonard's mind drifted elsewhere. It wasn't the image of Hill that haunted him now. No, it was the image of his grandson, Tyrone, gone forever. The life his grandson could have lived, the future he could have had been stolen in the blink of an eye. And for what? For the system's failures. For a moment of fear from a man who had been trained to protect, not to kill. The truth, Leonard now understood, was that there was no real satisfaction in what he had done. He had torn Hill's world apart, shattered his career, broken his marriage, and ruined his life. But none of that would bring Tyrone back. None of it would undo the deep wound in Leonard's heart, the hole that would never be filled. He had made sure that Hill would never walk freely again, but in doing so, he had created something he couldn't take back, a truth that weighed heavily on him. Leonard had set out to deliver justice where the system had failed, but in the quiet aftermath, he realized the cost. Revenge had its price. It didn't heal the wound, it only deepened it. The rage, the grief, the desire for retribution, it had all led him down a path that now felt empty. He had made Hill pay for his crime, but the world had moved on. The story would eventually fade, just like everything else. Hill's downfall would be remembered for a time, but eventually, new headlines would replace the old ones. The ache in Leonard's chest didn't ease. It was the same ache that had followed him since the day Tyrone died. Leonard hadn't done this for himself. He hadn't done it for revenge's sake. He had done it because he couldn't stand the thought of Tyrone's life being dismissed as just another statistic. He couldn't let his grandson be forgotten. But now that Hill was broken, Leonard didn't feel relief. He didn't feel victory. He felt nothing. The quiet emptiness that came with knowing that revenge, no matter how sweet it seemed at first, never truly fills the space left by the one you love. As Leonard stood there, staring at the screen, he realized that the real cost of revenge wasn't in the destruction of Hill. It was in the destruction of his own peace of mind. What he had done to Hill was necessary in his mind, but it had come at a great cost. Leonard had acted out of a sense of duty, of anger, of justice. But now, looking at the result, he understood that vengeance never heals. It simply moves the wound from one place to another. Leonard left his home that night without a word to anyone. The news was full of reports on Hill's downfall, the officers who had turned against him, and the devastation of his personal life. But Leonard had no interest in the drama unfolding outside his door. He knew what he had done, and he knew it would never bring him peace. He had delivered justice in his own way, but it didn't fix anything. Not really. He walked quietly through the streets of the city, his footsteps echoing softly in the cold night air. The city was alive with noise, with movement, with people who had already forgotten what had just happened. But Leonard couldn't forget. His steps were steady, purposeful, as if he was walking towards something he couldn't name. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't care. What mattered now was that he could leave it all behind. The pain, the grief, the need for revenge. He could vanish, just as he had before. Leonard had never been a man who sought recognition, and he wouldn't start now. No one would know where he went. No one would ask. His disappearance would be as quiet as his arrival had been. Just as Reggie Tate had done before him, Leonard would slip into the shadows, leaving behind a world that had refused to listen until it was too late. The silence that followed would be his final statement. Not everyone needed to know who had made sure Hill paid the price. Sometimes silence was enough. The next morning, the news cycle moved on. Hill's name was still in the headlines, but already the media had begun to shift focus to other stories. Hill's personal devastation was played out across every channel. But Leonard wasn't part of the story anymore, and he didn't want to be. The truth had been exposed. The community now saw Hill for what he was, a man who had abused his position of power, who had taken an innocent life, and who had manipulated his way out of consequences for far too long. But that wasn't the end of the story. The end came, quietly, when the world wasn't looking. The end came when Leonard Ford disappeared. Leonard's story wasn't one of grand victories or battles won. It was a quiet story, one of grief, of loss, and of a man who simply couldn't stand by and let the world move on without remembering what had happened. Leonard hadn't saved anyone, and he hadn't solved the world's problems. But for him, the act of making Hill face the consequences of his actions, however small, was the only justice he could deliver. As Leonard walked into the unknown, leaving his home and his life behind, he realized that the real truth was simple. Justice wasn't about victory. It wasn't about proving you were right or getting what you deserved. It was about making sure the truth was heard, even when the world wanted to forget. Leonard's final act wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure Tyrone's name was never erased. It was about making sure that, even in the silence, someone remembered. And so, Leonard Ford disappeared into the night, just as quietly as he had lived his life. No one ever knew where he went, and perhaps that was the point. He had done what the system would not, but in the end, he found peace not in the destruction of his enemy, but in the quietness of the life he had left behind. The story of Hill's fall would echo for a while, but Leonard's story? That would fade into the background, as quiet as the man himself. A ghost remembered not for the violence he caused, but for the quiet reckoning he brought when no one else would. And that silence, in its own way, spoke louder than any victory ever could.